Hello, and welcome to today's edition of FNR Ask the Expert. Today, we're talking about bird and salamander research on the Hardwood Ecosystem Experiment, or HEE, as it's commonly known. Last month, we talked with Dr. Mike Saunders and Charlotte Owings, and they gave us an introduction to the project as a whole. But today, we have two of the many researchers who have been working on site there joining us. First, we have Danielle Williams. She's the HEE field coordinator. She was a survey bird technician on the project as an undergrad before joining her current role. And we also have Allison Oakes, who's a PhD student working under Dr. Rob Swihart and Dr. Saunders, and she's studying the impact of timber management on salamanders in Indiana hardwood forests. So to get us started, Danielle's going to offer us a little refresher about the HEE and then share about the bird research that's being done on site. And then Allison's going to chime in and tell us all about what's going on with salamanders on the HEE. So just a reminder, if you have any questions about the HEE or for Allison and Danielle throughout today's broadcast, please place those in the comments section here on Facebook and we'll answer them as time allows. So without further ado, Danielle, take it away and share what's going on in the world of birds on the HEE.
All right, thank you. Oops. Go back here. So today I'm going to cover our breeding bird surveys on the HEE. So this is one of our long-term ongoing project aspects of the project since its beginning and hopefully until its end. So just a very quick HEE refresher. I do recommend going back and watching Mike and Charlotte's video if you didn't get a chance last month, or visit our website, heeforeststudy.org, to sort of get the background. But the really quick background on the project is that historically our central hardwood forests were periodically disturbed by burning, by land clearing, all sorts of different things that made sort of a mosaic of habitat through the forest. And now the best way we can replicate those disturbances is by forest management. So sort of the whole point of the HEE is to figure out what management techniques are best for wildlife and human use out in the forest. So we're looking at even age management, uneven age management, and control units out there, and doing all kinds of monitoring on all kinds of wildlife, vegetation, etc. So that is the quickest rundown you can get of the HEE. So I do recommend reading further if you didn't watch the video last month. So I always like to start bird presentations with this slide, which is basically why study birds, because I do get that question occasionally. One thing is, of course, that they are ecologically important. So like every other animal out there, they have their place. They're seed dispersers, they're food sources for other animals. They eat a lot of insects. So they're part of the bigger picture, certainly. One really cool thing about birds is that they're highly mobile. Obviously, birds can fly. So we can see really fast responses to any sort of management we do. With other animals, it might take a long time for them to move in and out of new habitat types, whereas birds, you're going to see a response to habitat changes really quickly. They're easy to detect, so some birders might disagree with you on that on certain species, but in general, we can go out, we can listen for these birds, we can look for them, and we're gonna find a big proportion of the ones that are out in the forest. And finally, it seems counterintuitive to say that we like to study these because they're well studied. But when we know a lot about their life cycles, a lot about their physiology, biology, we can interpret a lot of the results we get. So we can sort of understand why the birds are responding the way they are to our forest management. On that note, one way we can sort of break down birds into categories is by habitat. So we refer to these as habitat guilds, and it's just based on basically what kind of habitat they use, especially during the nesting season. So habitat needs do change throughout the year, but we think about this in terms of where they like to establish territories and raise their young. So on the HEE, what we're interested in a lot of times is looking at early successional birds versus mature forest birds. So by early successional, I just mean young forests, sort of shrubby, thick areas that birds like gray catbird and common yellowthroat like, versus the more undisturbed, open understory forests that birds like the scarlet tanager and Acadian flycatcher prefer. If we think about it in this sort of context, that we have birds that use different habitat types, it's kind of intuitive to think that having a lot of these habitat types available is the thing that's going to lead to bird diversity. So to get a diversity of birds, we really need a mix of mature forest and early successional forest. So one of the questions on the HEE with this bird project is to sort of say, is our management creating the needed habitat? Are we creating habitat for our early successional species while also making sure there's enough habitat for our mature forest birds to succeed? And then of course, there are other smaller things like, are there enough standing dead trees for woodpeckers, like the pileated you can see in the photo? So in order to do our research, we basically have to count birds. So obviously we can't go out there and count every single bird in the forest. That would be sort of impossible. So we created bird survey points. In the beginning of the project, there were about 265 of these bird survey points throughout our 9 study units. That has been changed to about 181, just we changed the spacing based on some feedback we got from other scientists. So sometime between 6 and 11 a.m. in the morning, the techs go out to each point and they stand there and they look and listen and record every single bird they detect during a 10-minute period. So they're detecting them by sight and sound, and they're recording every individual bird, not just every species, so that we can see the abundance of the birds as well as the species diversity. These surveys were done before the timber harvest and have been done almost every year after them. There have been a couple years we've missed, but it's been pretty regular. And we do all of these surveys during the breeding season. So during May and June, because that's when the male birds are vocalizing so that we can get the best count of individuals out there. So here's sort of our findings so far in a nutshell. So we've had the highest number of species detected in those units that have harvest areas. So that's where we're getting the greatest bird diversity. Early successional species did respond positively to the harvest. So birds like the eastern towhee, indigo bunting, yellow-breasted chat that were really rare before the harvest are pretty abundant out there now. So they're definitely using those areas, and that habitat was created successfully. Mature forest birds are a little different. They had a more mixed response. Some increased in the harvest areas, some decreased, some were unchanged. So whereas we can kind of say this is how you manage for the early successional guild, we can't really make that broad statement with the mature forest guild. You sort of have to look at it on a species by species basis. So the broad takeaways from the bird research so far are that timber harvest did result in that suitable habitat for early successional species, and diverse habitat did lead to greater bird diversity in this case. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Like Wendy said, if you have questions, please leave them in the comments, but I'll toss it back to Wendy.
Great intro there, Danielle. You mentioned a lot of really cool species. I can't wait to hear about more of those later, and maybe some of the things we've done with those various species. I know there's very specific research has gone on at the HEE with regards to birds. But with that said, let's give our salamanders a little spotlight here. So I'm going to toss it to Allison, and she's going to fill us in a little bit about the creatures that she's studying, the different species, and also just salamanders in general on the HEE. So Allison, take it away.
All right. Let me find. Here we go. So now that we've heard about birds and a bit about the HEE, we'll talk salamanders. There we go. So salamanders are a type of amphibian. They generally look sort of lizard-like in body shape, but they have smooth skin instead of scales. So they can be roughly sorted into 3 major groups. Aquatic salamanders, like the axolotl or the hellbender, spend their entire lives in water. While semi-aquatic salamanders, which include the spotted salamander and the tiger salamander, spend part of their lives in the water, but part of their lives on land in terrestrial habitats. Terrestrial salamanders, on the other hand, which include the plethodontid genus, which includes the redback species, one of our stars at the HEE, spend their entire lives on the forest floor. So they're found in a number of different habitats. In the water, salamanders tend to prefer streams, and they'll hide under large flat rocks or in crevices. Semi-aquatic salamanders in their terrestrial habitats are found under rocks and logs, or in the cracks of those big mossy boulders you see. But they'll make these very, very long migrations during the breeding season to breeding ponds, where they'll mate and lay eggs and then return to their terrestrial habitats. Terrestrial salamanders are usually found under rocks and logs on the forest floor. The Plethodontid genus, which I've mentioned before, is the largest genus of terrestrial salamander. They're also called the lungless salamander because they don't actually have any lungs. They breathe entirely through their skin, which has to remain moist at all times. So if it gets too hot or too cold, they will go up to several feet underground just to find those little damp pockets of soil to hide in until conditions are better. So there's 23 species of salamander in Indiana. I'm not going to read all of these off. You can look them up later if you'd like, or just read it yourself on here. There are 4 endangered species. That's the hellbender, and I've got a picture up there. The mole salamander, the northern red salamander, and my little zoom window is covering that, the green salamander. 2 species of special concern, which are declining populations, but they're not quite endangered, is the blue spotted salamander and the streamside salamander. There's a number of species that are sort of uncommonly or not commonly found within the states, and the common species, which include our stars at the HEE, which is the redback salamander, the zigzag salamander, and the slimy salamander. So salamanders are very important to forest ecosystems. They are very, very highly abundant. There are a lot of them down there. There was a study in New Hampshire that found that the mass of salamanders on the forest floor outweighed that of any other vertebrate in the forest. So there was more weight of salamanders than there was of deer, than there was of small mammals, than there was of birds. There's a lot of them. So they're very important to food webs because what they do is they eat a lot of things that are too small for anything else to bother with. Arthropods, that's our insects and bugs that crawl in the soil. The salamanders eat those and then they get eaten by larger things. Some species of birds, some species of small mammals, and they move energy up the food chain. They're also very useful as indicators of forest health because they have such high populations and fairly broad ranges, and especially because of their skin, they're very sensitive to changes in soil chemistry or soil quality, and especially pollutants within the system. We can look at populations of salamanders and have a general idea of what's going on in the forest itself, which maybe means you don't have to do very expensive tests or very difficult tests. You can just keep an eye on your salamanders. So at the HEE, we've been doing salamander research since 2007, where Rod Williams and Jamie McNeil started a project using coverboard grids. So I've got a picture down there. Coverboards are just basically blocks of wood that we set into the soil, and it mimics natural cover objects. So a salamander will hide underneath the board, and we can check those boards and count how many salamanders we find at a given site. The first study with Williams and McNeil ran from 2007 to 2011, about 2 years after all of our harvesting went in. And then in 2019, I added some other grids to look specifically at prescribed fire. At those grids, we're also doing visual implant elastomer marking. I've got that picture down there too. It's a little bit of color that fluoresces under a UV light, so we can tell salamanders apart and count them individually. That gives us much, much, much better population estimates than just sort of looking at the salamanders and guessing. So the initial findings, what we've got so far from McNeil and Williams' study, salamanders decline following clear cuts, which is, the large, you take out all the trees, and patch cuts, which are basically clear cuts but smaller. The declines that we saw at the HEE were less than those in other studies. We think probably because our clear cuts were a lot smaller than those in other studies. So the initial stage of a shelterwood harvest, which is at the HEE, it's a 2-stage cut. So we left some trees behind the first time, did not show any effects on salamander counts, which we think is because they left enough trees behind to get some canopy cover. So the temperatures stayed low, the moisture levels stayed high, and the salamanders weren't as badly affected. Edge effects from the clear cuts, the distance the effects from the clear cutting reached into the forest maxed out at about 20 meters, which is about equal to what's been found in other studies. One thing that has been noted both in this study and in other studies is concerns that the impacts of patch cuts may be greater than what we're finding in this kind of study. Because patch cut for timber management usually involves multiple visits to sites over a larger area, it might have stronger effects on salamanders than what we can see from these coverboard grids. But that's what we found so far. We have about 1 year of prescribed fire data to work with, and looking forward to another few years of that so we can get some analyses going. And I think that's all I had on this PowerPoint, so I'll pass it back to Wendy.
Awesome. And I've put more information about that McNeil and Williams study that Allison mentioned in our comment section, so feel free to look that up on your own. We have our first question from the audience, and it's for you, Allison. Sue wants to know, do all salamanders fluoresce? And I hope I'm saying that properly scientifically. So
the VIE marking is a specific mark that we put on the salamanders that fluoresces in a different color. There actually have been a couple of studies that have found that some salamander species do have some bioluminescence. They do fluoresce on their own. Not really sure why yet, not really sure what it's for, some kind of signaling, but that's pretty cool, I think.
So they're not warning us like some of the brightly colored poisonous species that we're used to in frogs or snakes. They're just happen to be really pretty and glow.
Yeah, most of it is bioluminescence under UV light, so it's not something we can see just looking. There are a couple of species that are mildly poisonous. I think I had a picture in my slideshow of one of the red F or the bright orange stage of the spotted newt. You'll see them on the forest floor. They tromp around. They are bright orange with blue spots, and that is because they have a very, very mild neurotoxin. And they're warning things away.
Good to know. So it's okay. I guess here's a question for you then. Is it okay if I touch some of these species that might be floating around in my forest or yard or whatever? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's not going to hurt you at all. I would advise, if you're trying to pick them up, make sure you don't have any sunscreen, any lotions, any bug spray on your hands, because their skin is so absorbent that will hurt them.
We don't want that. We don't want to hurt any creatures, no matter how bad we might want to sometimes. But salamanders are cool, so we're going to stick with
They're very
that.
cute.
They are very cute. I guess, Allison, one more question. You talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but what's the difference between a lizard and a salamander and a newt and all of these other things that the general population just lumps into one category of lizards?
Yeah, so there are lizards and there are salamanders. Lizards are reptiles, so they have scales. They tend to live entirely on land. They don't need to stay moist. You'll see them sunning themselves because they need the heat more than they need any sort of moisture or water. Excuse me. Salamanders are amphibians, so they need to stay damp. No matter what species, they have some connection to water. Visually, salamanders have very, very smooth skin. They don't have scales, whereas reptiles, you can see the little pebbly lizard skin. Newts there are some species of salamanders that are called newts. Most of them live in the water, but they are just sort of a subcategory of salamander.
Good to clear that up. So don't accidentally call a salamander a lizard, or you just might upset some people that work with them. There was a particular herpetologist I know that that had a little incident with that. So Um, but anyway, so let's talk a little bit more about research. Danielle, you mentioned that they go out and for 10 minutes listen to all kinds of birds and write them all down. How do they know 181 different species? How do you learn that?
So training is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to the bird research on the HEE. So I actually made a little slide on it because I thought this might come up. Let me bring that up for you. So the techs do have to learn to ID about 100 species by sight and sound. So one thing, we are lucky enough that a lot of our techs are folks who are in wildlife programs or biology programs who have at least taken an ornithology course. So they might come in knowing like 20 to 30 species of song. Song is the most important part. So if you think about trying to spot all the birds in a given area in 10 minutes out in the forest, you're just not going to be able to do it visually. They're in the leaves, they're way up in the canopy. So you really do have to be able to detect them by ear. So we actually have this tech start training weeks before they ever get to the HEE. When they're first hired, we send out like a training module and a CD, some online resources. And a lot of them will use resources on their own, like the Cornell All About Birds or the Merlin app, that kind of thing, to start practicing their birds. And then once we get them here, we spend about a whole week doing bird training. So the field coordinator, who it was Jeff Regal before me now, will take them out to the units and we'll do a lot of practice counts sort of as a group. We'll do some in pairs, we'll do some singly and then compare what we get. To try to get the techs consistent with each other and consistent with me so that we get good data. In the past too, we've had techs actually carry recorders out to their points so that later if we see something that seems really weird on a data sheet, we can actually go back to that recording of the point and listen in and see what we can hear. Yeah, it's a lot of work. We have to get really good people who are willing to really put in the work to learn all of these birds.
I guess as a person who's hearing a bazillion different types of birds in their own backyard, it seems a lot of times they step on each other. Is there a way that you guys can differentiate one species from another in just a short, I mean, I feel like it's like name that tune in like three notes or something.
Well, everybody kind of has their own way of doing it. I personally sometimes will kind of start with the really common stuff. So I'll just count like, okay, I know I'm hearing 3 red-eyed vireos because they sing constantly and there are usually 3 or 4 at every single point. And then once I've got those down, I tune them out. And then I say, is there a Carolina wren? Is there, sort of go through in my head the different stuff I might be hearing. Some folks actually, to keep track of which birds they've noted, will draw a little map on the back of their data point and be like, okay, I'm here, draw a circle, and then sort of mark where they're hearing the birds, and then transfer that to the data sheet. Sometimes I will think like lower to higher pitch. So, okay, am I hearing something super high pitched like a cedar waxwing? Kind of filter down from there. So everybody has their own little mental system, and it's something that honestly just takes a lot of practice. I know the techs get better over the whole season, and then if they come back the next year, they're like experts and can help train the current year of people. So it's a real process.
As you mentioned, it all starts with good people.
Yes, that's the most important part.
So Allison, we talked a little bit about bird research. Now let's talk a little bit about the salamander research. You mentioned the cover boards. What exactly do we do with those? You said they're in the ground and the salamanders get under them. Do you just open them and see who's there and mark those down, or how do we track what's in those cover boards?
Yeah, so pretty much we just set the cover boards down. We give them about 2 weeks to weather, we call it, which is just sort of to become less of a finely carved piece of lumber and more of a like thing you left in the forest for 2 weeks, which is what the salamanders prefer. And they'll hide under it just like they would with any other sort of rock or log in the forest floor. And it gives us some more control over our counts, over the area that we've searched, over the amount of cover that's in an area. And we just look underneath, count the number of salamanders, count the species, note down things, whether they're adults or juveniles, which you mostly just tell by size. A few morphology characteristics. Some of our species have like a red phase and a lead phase, where that red stripe is actually black instead of the bright red color. And yeah, let them go. They'll use them like any other habitat. Salamanders can actually, there's a few species that are territorial, so they might defend their chosen cover from other salamanders. So we have a couple that will like stick to one cover board, and with the VIE marking especially, you can tell, yep, here he is again. Week 2, week 3, week 4, still there.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, Allison, then so do we mark them, or is that certain species that we mark, or how does that happen?
So that is specifically for the prescribed fire project right now. I have a subset of coverboard grids where I will do the visual implant elastomer marking. And it's that little bit of color that tells us which salamander is which. They all get a different pattern and different colors. And that way, those ones we will actually pull out from underneath the board and check their mark to see which one exactly they are. The larger grids with the timber harvesting data that's going back to 2007, we haven't been doing that because it takes a lot of time and there are a lot of salamanders. I have one of my grids where I think we pulled out like 70 or 80 salamanders in one day. And we're checking multiple grids in a day. So we don't really have too much time to spend on each and every single salamander. So that's just a subset that we're marking.
So there's a lot of, as you mentioned, more weight of salamanders than deer. So we understand, you're forgiven. Danielle, so you talked about some of the species out on the HEE. What are some of the ones that are maybe less common that we haven't really heard of, or other ones that are being studied on the HEE?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, most of what I went over was sort of our general breeding bird surveys, but there have been folks and still are folks that are studying more specifically the biology of certain species. Let me bring up another slide here. So one of the big ones is our cerulean warbler research. So Ball State University actually does this. Grad students and Dr. Kamal Islam have been working on cerulean warblers since the beginning of the project. And they've done a lot of really cool stuff because they actually go find these individual birds, they capture them and color band them so they know who's who. And then they can sort of track their whole life cycle throughout the season. So they're figuring out where they are, where they're spending their time, whether they have a nest, whether that nest is successful. And this is important because this is a state endangered bird. And historically, people have sort of assumed that they're associated with mature forest, but actually what Dr. Islam has found is that they are highest in our harvested units, highest in number, and lowest in our control units where we aren't harvesting. So they found some really interesting things. Another really cool project that went on a couple years ago is a banding project in our clear cuts. So as Allison mentioned, the clear cuts are these 10-acre areas where all the trees were removed. And Patrick went in and set up mist nets and just caught any bird that flew through these little flyways. And he would also band them so he could identify them later. And he found all kinds of cool stuff. One being that worm-eating warblers were his highest capture. And those are another bird that are typically associated with mature forest. But what he was finding is they were nesting in the mature forest and then bringing their fledglings, so the young of that year, to the clear cuts to take shelter and to eat, etc. So that was a super cool project. We've also studied ruffed grouse in the past, done drumming surveys, and now there is an effort to put trail cams out to try to detect them. That's a bird that's been declining heavily throughout the whole eastern United States. There are nightjar surveys that go on. So Scott Holton from Indiana DNR is doing nightjar surveys periodically throughout the units. So that's whippoorwills, things like that. There have been owl surveys in the past. That was citizen science. So actually volunteers went out and tried to record owls throughout the units. And then there have been American woodcock surveys in the past. So there's been a ton of bird research on the HEE. That's why I just covered one small part of it for the main part of my presentation.
Perfect. Allison, we have another question for you. Can salamanders be kept as pets? Or I guess the better question is, should they be?
So there are a few species in the pet trade. The axolotl are big ones. They're the little aquatic species. May have seen pictures. I had a picture in my slide with their normal coloration. I know the pale coloration is very popular in the pet trade, and I see a lot of those, and I have some friends who've kept them quite well. Some species probably wouldn't do very well in the pet trade. They're just not very interesting to be kept as pets. They do spend most of their lives underground, or would have two specific requirements. The big issue with pet trade right now is moving salamanders around. There is currently a fungal infection in Europe that is quite damaging to the salamander populations over there. They think it came in through the pet trade, and we are desperately preparing for when it hits the United States, because it's expected to get here, and it's going to be really, really bad. So that's the biggest issue with the pet trade in terms of salamanders. As long as you're not, importing species, keeping to the species that are advised to be kept as pets, it shouldn't be a big problem as long as you're doing it right.
But I probably shouldn't just grab one out of the creek on my property and decide to keep them in my house.
Definitely not. Wild salamanders have, especially stream salamanders, have some very, very specific requirements for water quality. A lot of them are protected species, and there are laws against that sort of just picking up wildlife. So definitely not.
Danielle, maybe a little different on your case, though. We want to get some of these birds onto our local properties for various reasons, for ecological reasons, and just to enjoy them. What are some of the ways that, as a private landowner, that I can do that and both enjoy them and also help the environment at the same time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Whenever we talk about private land, it's pretty individualized depending on the property. One of the first things I'll tell folks is kind of look around at your surroundings and see what kind of habitat is needed. So if you're completely surrounded by fields and you have a woodlot, I would definitely keep that a woodlot and just try to make it the best habitat you can. So remove invasive species. There's certain woodland species like Asian bush honeysuckle that are really sort of act as traps for birds. So controlling invasives is a really good first step in improving habitat. You can also think about planting wildlife friendly species. Anything that produces a nut or a berry is really good for a lot of birds. And a lot of those shrubby things create a lot of cover as well. And it kind of just depends on what species you want to manage for. So if you want wood warblers, you're going to want to try to manage forest. If you want grassland birds, you're going to want to try to manage, for sort of an open prairie type environment. One thing you can do is contact your local district biologist or district forester. They're really, really good at figuring out what to do to manage for all kinds of wildlife. And sometimes they can even help you get some sort of cost share assistance for doing that. So that's a good first step when you're thinking about private land.
Always good to use the professionals when they're available to
Oh,
make
yeah.
your job a little easier.
It gets them out of the office too. I was a private lands person for about a year, so I know about that life.
So are there any species that you guys have not found that you hope to find on the HEE? Both first with you, Danielle, and then also Allison.
Yeah, there's one kind of big one that we kept expecting to see to some extent that we didn't, and that is the ruffed grouse. So I mentioned that we've done these ruffed grouse drumming surveys for years, but unfortunately we have not gotten any grouse. There have been like 2 or 3 sightings of grouse on the HEE properties near the harvest areas, just sort of incidental ones. So somebody was out and they saw a grouse crossing the road or, you know, whatever. But we haven't actually detected them in any sort of scientific way. They do prefer young, early successional forest, but I think by the time our project came around to create some of that habitat, population had just declined a lot already. So, you know, if there isn't a source of birds, there's not any birds to sort of move into these areas. We still have hope for the future. They're not, our few sightings tell us they're not completely gone. And there's efforts, like I mentioned earlier, to try to use like trail cams to detect them, because they're definitely a species of concern in the state that we'd really like to see on our HEE properties more often.
Allison, are there any species of salamanders that we have hoped to see or that probably we anticipated seeing but haven't showed up yet?
I don't think so, not quite as much. Not like birds especially. We have the 3 major species at the HEE, which are the ones we find all the time. The redback, the zigzag, and the slimy. And those are the most common species. The thing is, our properties at the HEE, they don't really have enough water on them to get a really high diversity of salamander species. I've found a couple of spotted salamanders, which is really cool to see. It's not enough to do anything with in terms of research and statistics, but it's always fun to find them. But it's just not quite the right kind of area to see a lot of them. They'd want to stick closer to the ponds, closer to the streams, which we just don't have in our sites.
Speaking of timing, I know Danielle mentioned, you know, May and June are really big for those that are out there listening for the birds. Is there a really big time of year for you guys doing the salamander research that they're very prevalent, or that's the best time to find them, if you will?
Yeah, so it also depends on the species a bit, but the ones we find at the HEE, we get the most during the spring and fall. So I mentioned earlier, they go underground if it's too hot or too cold, so that little spot in spring from about March to April up in Indiana, when the snow's gone away and it hasn't gotten super blasted heat yet. And then again in the fall, just before it starts snowing, is around the best time to find terrestrial salamanders. The semi-aquatic species like the spotted salamander, the tiger salamanders, they have these massive migrations, which is the best time to find them because you can do something called road cruising, which is where you find a road that's near wetland and you drive very, 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 very slowly with a spotlight, and you can just watch all of the amphibians, and you'll get salamanders, you'll get frogs that are moving around this wetland going to the breeding ponds. So that is generally also around the spring and fall, but it depends on the species in particular, what time of year they'll be out and about.
So again, we're not hurting them, we're just trying to see them.
You go slow enough and try to get out of the way. Road mortality is a major problem for a lot of these species during those migrations. Because highways, especially that bisect wetlands, that go through wetlands, will see a lot of roadkill. There's a road actually through Purdue, Lindbergh Road, which goes through Cedar Bog, that there was a paper on looking at how many amphibians died on that road, and it's a lot.
So I guess you mentioned roads as a potential danger. Are there other dangers for the salamanders that you're studying or that are out in our general Indiana population?
So the major threats to amphibians and salamanders is habitat loss, which it is for a lot of the species that are in trouble in the world. Road mortality is big for the migrating species. For the fungal infection is the problem over in Europe that we're anticipating. Yeah, the thing about salamanders is they're very sensitive to changes in their environment. So the hellbenders, which are they're I think the largest species in the United States, very famous because we have some researchers at Purdue who are looking at them. They're very, very endangered because they're incredibly sensitive to water quality. So if your stream gets too murky, if your stream gets too polluted, if your stream has a slight change in water chemistry, they'll just disappear. Um, and that goes for a lot of other stream salamanders too. Cairns, that's actually a big deal in a lot of areas. Hikers building cairns and moving the rocks out of streams. Any flat rock in a stream is a possible salamander habitat. Any of those habitats, salamanders can be territorial. They're not going to just go and find another rock. So cairn building can be a problem in a lot of places along popular hiking trails.
So again, don't move it. It's not yours. It's their house.
Just don't bother them. Just don't bother them.
We don't want to anybody breaking into our house, so we don't need to break into theirs. So Danielle, let's talk a little bit about current findings and future. I'm going to ask you to, see the future a little bit here. What are some of the coolest or biggest findings you guys have had in the 16 years on the HEE in relationship to birds, and where do you see this going in this 100-year project?
So I think one of the most surprising findings we had came from that banding research I mentioned earlier. As I said, certain birds like worm-eating warblers, scarlet tanagers, ovenbirds are the common knowledge is that they like mature forest, that if you cut down the forest in any size, they're not going to be there, that they like that undisturbed forest. But his banding study, actually the bird species he captured most was the worm-eating warbler, and scarlet tanager and ovenbird were up there as well. So I think that surprised a lot of us because it totally went against conventional wisdom about these species. And what he was finding is, yes, during our breeding bird surveys in May and June, when they're establishing those territories, they are actually mostly building their nests up in those mature forests. However, once the young birds fledge, so once they're able to fly, but they're still dependent on their parents and they can leave the nest, the parents were taking them to our clear cuts. Just because if you think about it, if you haven't been in a 6-year-old, 7-year-old clear cut, it's kind of hard to understand, but you literally can't walk through them. It's all thorny, blackberry, things like that. You have to cut a path through them to even go in. So that's a really safe place to be if you're a bird, because nothing's going to try to go in there to eat your little fledglings that can't fly very well yet. So it turns out those are really valuable habitat types. So that surprised a lot of us. I thought it was really cool. As far as the future, our bird surveys are slated to continue for the whole duration of the project. So we're going to have this really cool, super long-term data set to first of all look at how birds continue to respond to these areas as they continue to regenerate. And not to mention just these long-term data sets are really valuable in general. So a while back, there was a big study that got a lot of press that talked about how birds were declining globally. And that study was a big meta-analysis of a lot of different data sets on birds. So data sets like ours can contribute to those larger findings on birds, not just in Indiana, not just in North America, but across the globe. So I think our bird research is very cool. And I hope there are more grad students who want to do awesome banding projects like Patrick's in the future.
And speaking of those awesome grad students, Allison, tell us, kind of wrap it up with a little bit about your research, what you found so far and what you hope to find in the future in relationship to salamanders on the HEE.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about my project. We're looking at data from 10 to 15 years post-harvest, which hasn't really been studied on that time scale. There's a lot of studies that are just after harvest and a lot of studies that are like 100 years later. But we're really hoping to see whether we're starting to see signs of recovery, whether, how that's going, that sort of thing. The prescribed fire study I'm also really excited about because that's just starting. And I'm hoping I'll really be able to tie it into some of the intensity of the fire and the types of fire that we see, because the studies on that has not been really well standardized, in that sort of like people don't always ask about the intensity of the fire. There's like, okay, there was a fire, what happened to the salamanders? And it's like, okay, so what kind of fire? How bad was the fire? And it's hard to say, okay, did you see an effect on salamanders? Well, maybe you didn't because it was a really small fire, but you're not telling me. So we're going to have that data on fire intensity to work with, and we'll be able to see really what's happening with that.
Very cool. Who knew that fire was involved with salamanders? I mean, you learn something every day. Well, thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Allison. I know I learned a lot about birds and salamanders on the HEE, and not only that, but how those affect me as a city dweller, if you will, and how I can help both of those populations. So I appreciate you guys joining us. Just a reminder that we will have someone from the HEE on with us the last Thursday of every month. So we'll have another group coming in August, August, September, and October so far we have scheduled. So tune in for those. Next week, we have Ask the Expert on rainscaping. So that will be more ways that you as an individual can help the environment where you are. So again, Danielle, Allison, thank you for sharing your knowledge and for sharing what you're doing at the HEE. Incredibly important work, and thank you for sharing.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you again next week, 3 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday, August 6th, and we'll be joined by Kara Salazar and one of our extension district people who will be talking about rainscaping and how you can get involved with that project. So see you then. Thank you.